Hi, I'm talking to you today from the kitchen. Well, from my virtual old-fashioned kitchen. I'm actually talking to you today in April of 2020, and we're right in the middle of the coronavirus shelter in place, which seems to have gotten a lot of people baking and cooking. Maybe you're one of them, or maybe you've seen some of the pictures on Facebook or Instagram. People are posting pictures often of their failed attempts, and maybe you've had some of them yourself. Maybe you've had cookies that burned, or bread that didn't rise, or scones that don't look like scones, or cake that just didn't really turn out the way you'd hope. Well, it turns out that these kind of problems are actually problems that people have been facing when they're trying to cook and bake at home for a long time, at least 100 years. And these kind of problems actually gave birth to one of America's most famous cooks, and that is Betty Crocker. Now, if you're American, I'm guessing you probably know the name Betty Crocker, and you might think of her as the red spoon on a box of cake mix or a can of frosting or something like that. There's a lot more to Betty Crocker than a red spoon or a cake mix. So who was Betty Crocker? Well, Betty Crocker, believe it or not, it might be surprising to learn, Betty Crocker isn't a real person, and she never was. Betty Crocker was the brainchild of an advertising campaign for the Washburn Crosby Company. Washburn Crosby was a Minneapolis-based flour milling company. It started in the 1800s, and it would eventually evolve into General Mills. But one of Washburn Crosby's most famous products, gold medal flour, is what kickstarted Betty Crocker's career. Here's how it happened. In 1921, Washburn Crosby placed an ad on the back cover of the Saturday Evening Post for its gold medal flour. It was kind of cute. The ad was sort of a puzzle of this quaint old-fashioned street scene. You would finish the puzzle, complete it, and then mail it in, and they would send you a prize, which was a pincushion in the shape of a mini bag of gold medal flour. The response was staggering. They got something like 30,000 completed puzzles. But what really surprised them was that bakers also were starting to send in their problems that they were having. Like, why does my cake crack on top? How long am I supposed to need flour dough for bread for? How do I make a good one crust cherry pie? In hindsight, this isn't really that surprising. There were not nearly the number of cookbooks in 1921 as there are today. Pan sizes weren't standardized, oven temperatures fluctuated. But still, Washburn Crosby was a little bit surprised. Their ad company their ad department had gotten some letters from consumers with questions, and they usually asked the home services department to answer these, and they would get sent out under the ad department's name. But the head of the ad department, a guy named Samuel Gay, realized this was an opportunity. He could build a relationship with gold medal flour customers by sending them back cheery letters written from a real person. And it would sound more credible if it was a woman. So he made up a friendly sounding character who he called Betty Crocker. Crocker was actually the last name of a recently retired executive. Betty was just a warm, wholesome, friendly sounding name. Betty was actually the fourth most popular name in the US in 1921. So it was familiar and it was friendly. So what they started to do was send out letters from Betty Crocker. And to take it a step further, he actually had all the female employees at Washburn Crosby write out Betty Crocker's signature, and the one that looked the most friendly and appealing was from a secretary named Florence Lindbergh. Her signature started to appear at the bottom of every letter sent out about baking or cooking or consumer problems. It was a sort of chief of correspondence. It turned out that this was a huge service, and Betty Crocker quickly became the sort of Dear Abby for American cooks and bakers. Consumer demand became so big that within a few years, Washburn Crosby had a staff of home economists of 21. They were sometimes nicknamed the Crockerettes. They would test out recipes, they would write letters back, and they actually traveled the country visiting cooking schools and high school home economics departments, giving demonstrations and sharing recipes. But what really made Betty Crocker take off In 1924, she got a voice when Washburn Crosby launched an on-air cooking radio show called the Betty Crocker Cooking School of the Air. It debuted on Minneapolis radio station. It pretty much saved that radio station from bankruptcy. It quickly sped nationwide. Actually, originally, they would write up the radio scripts in Minneapolis and send them out to radio stations across the country. So the voice of Betty Crocker on radio stations across the country was different. That eventually was standardized. The first voice of Betty Crocker actually belonged to a home economist named Marjorie Child Husted. She wrote the scripts, and in Minneapolis, she actually hosted the show. To give you an idea of how much people responded to this radio show, the Betty Crocker radio show continued for 24 years with 1 million listeners enrolled in the school. If you completed the projects and sent in reports, your reports would be graded and you could eventually earn a certificate from the Betty Crocker School. Betty also helped out during the war. She provided advice to homemakers on things like how to make the most of rationed food. You could, for example, make a mock steak if you mixed ground or chopped up steak meat with Wheaties and some cooking oil and spices. You could shape it into the shape of a T-bone steak, add some strips of carrot to look a little bit like the fat veins, and broil it and get your own mock steak. About 7 million copies of Betty Crocker's wartime rations booklet were distributed. Betty hit the height of her popularity in the 1940s. This is when she was receiving 5,000 letters a day. An article about Betty Crocker in the April 1945 issue of Fortune named her the second most recognized woman in the world, behind only that other famous First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. Surveys showed that 99 out of 100 American homemakers knew the name Betty Crocker. And that's when it all nearly came to an end. That same Fortune magazine article, after noting that she was the second most recognized woman in the world, also noted that what FDR had done for politics, Betty did for commerce, and then it outed Betty as a fake, as a fraud. This was the first article to really reveal Betty Crocker was not a real person. This is going to be the end of Betty Crocker. Well, not at all. Turns out that article didn't really hurt Betty's popularity very much, which is pretty telling, I think. Maybe it's a truism of good corporate branding. Betty Crocker didn't need to be real. She was fulfilling a very needed role. She was dishing out advice, alleviating fears about cooking, and helping homemakers get the skills that they need and earn recognition that what they did was valuable. She was needed and loved by millions. So what does Betty look like? Well, there's never been a photograph of Betty Crocker because, she's not real. But if you've ever picked up a Betty Crocker pamphlet at a grocery store, you might have seen portraits of her. This is my Betty Crocker picture cookie book, and you will note there is an image of Betty Crocker. The first portrait of Betty Crocker was actually created in 1936, and it was created by an artist named Nessa McMain. She was commissioned to create an image that was actually a composite. It blended together facial features from the female staffers at the Washburn Crosby Home Services Department, and that made sense, really. The women of the company had a collective hand in Betty's success. That portrait of Betty would actually be used for more than 20 years, longer than any other single Betty Crocker portrait. But since 1955, Betty's gotten an update a couple of times, 7 times actually. The 1955 version shows her as this grandmotherly character with some gray streaks in her hair. This is one of the few where she's actually smiling. In 1965, she was updated with a younger look, still with a bouffant hairdo and still that red and white outfit. She's gotten periodic changes ever since, although usually brunette hair and blue eyes. And as one magazine pointed, she doesn't seem to age much. She's always a sort of ageless, in their view, 32 or so. For her 75th anniversary in 1996, painter John Stuart Engel gave her olive skin that could belong to a number of ethnicities. This is the first Betty Crocker with brown eyes. Interestingly, Engel created this image by digitally morphing photographs of 75 different women chosen from a field of about 5,000 women that General Mills felt embodied the characteristics of Betty Crocker. But it's not just her look that's changed. In the effort to keep Betty current, she's evolved a lot. In 1951, Washburn Crosby actually hired an actress, a woman named Adelaide Hawley, to act as Betty on television. Hawley herself had no domestic experience, but she had experience public speaking. She'd had a radio program for a while, and she had a warm personality. She was the first of many women to play Betty Crocker on television, but none of her television programs really succeeded. She remained on TV, but only in a kind of circumscribed role, usually in television commercials, like one where she helped Gracie Allen to bake a cake. But Betty Crocker did keep evolving. She always stayed committed to the idea that part of her role was to help domestic women, homemakers, to recognize that what they did was valuable. It took skill and it took training. Anyone could learn it, but it did take some expertise. In 1954, the Betty Crocker Search for the All-American Homemaker of Tomorrow was launched. That lasted until 1977. The first Betty Crocker grocery product was a soup mix, which appeared on grocery shelves in 1941. Her famous cake mix debuted in 1947. Now, Betty Crocker was not the first company with a cake mix. They weren't even the first company to recognize that removing powdered eggs from the mix and asking homemakers to add their own fresh eggs increased sales. There was actually a company called B. Duff & Sons, which got a patent for a cake mix with fresh eggs in 1935. But Betty Crocker is maybe the best remembered today for recognizing that from a psychological standpoint, women wanted to feel more involved in the creative process, and adding fresh eggs is one way to do it. Not to mention that the cake tastes better when you add your own fresh eggs. What kind of disappeared with the cake mix was any sense that a cook's accomplishments deserved recognition. It doesn't take a lot of skill to create a cake out of the Betty Crocker yellow cake or spice cake or devil's food cake mix. In fact, if you notice in 1950s commercials, they don't even show the homemaker. It's just sort of faceless hands mixing it up. The only character you meet is the happy husband enjoying a slice of his cake.
When you make a cake from a mix, which do you want? A fresh egg cake or a cake made with dried eggs? For higher, lighter, tastier cake, why, fresh eggs, of course. But remember, all cake mixes are not alike. Betty Crocker cake mixes are different. They call for your eggs, added by you at home. It's the only national cake mix brand that lets you add the eggs. There's a reason why there are no dried egg whites, no dried egg yolks in Betty Crocker cake mixes. When you add the eggs, you're sure to get finer cakes most consistently. 9 out of 10 homemakers in recent tests said Betty Crocker cake mixes gave them bigger, taller cakes than the dried egg cake mixes they tested. Yes, and better tasting cakes, too. Try Betty Crocker Party Cake Mix for yellow, white, or spice cakes. And try Betty Crocker Chocolate Devil's Food Cake Mix for rich, moist devil's food with genuine fresh egg goodness. Get Betty Crocker cake mixes today.
In other words, the commercials in these days with the mixes sold the products on the basis of their taste, they taste delicious, and on the fact that they are so easy and so foolproof that anyone can do it time after time after time. But the skillful cook never really disappeared. In 1950, Betty Crocker's picture cookbook debuted. It was actually released in 1950 with an unprecedented printing of 950,000 copies. This version has actually been nicknamed Big Red. I think that General Mills has actually trademarked that on the basis of how beloved this cookbook has become. The Betty Crocker Picture Cookbook is actually today in its 12th printing. It's been revised a lot and a lot. There have been something like 75 million copies of the Betty Crocker Picture Cookbook sold over the many, many decades. It has been revised, I mentioned before, but what has always remained the same is that the Betty Crocker Cookbook features everyday favorites. This is where you go if you need a recipe for macaroni and cheese, or meatloaf, or chocolate chip cookies. These are simple, basic, everyday foods, and the recipes provided are step-by-step, sort of foolproof recipes for success. They always touted the recipes as having been triple tested, not just tested in the Betty Crocker kitchens, but also tested by ordinary homemakers. But it wasn't just the recipes that made this cookbook beloved. This was one of the very first cookbooks to feature illustrations. You had photographs of the finished products. You had photo series showing step-by-step processes. You wanted to make an angel food cake? Well, here's photographs showing you how to beat the eggs and fold them into the batter and hang the cake upside down afterwards. There were procedures and photos for how to frost a cake. You could learn what to do to feed a sick child. How do you stretch one cut of meat over 3 different meals? It was like a home ec class in a book. And when you look through the 1950 edition today, you see a lot of typical 1950s foods, you know, a lot of ham loaves and Jell-O salad. But like I mentioned, it's been revised and updated over the years. The 1969 version with a pie-shaped montage is sometimes called the Red Pie Cookbook. The one with a Mondrian-style pink and yellow and blue cover was first published in 1961. This tends to be the most sought after at online auctions. Maybe it's the one baby boomers recognize the most. But here's an interesting thing. The 1950 book was such a success that in 1998, Betty Crocker released a facsimile replica, same cover, same recipes inside, recognizing that a lot of baby boomers had nostalgic memories of making these recipes, of learning how to cook with their mother out of this cookbook, and of eating these foods. So for baby boomers who wanted to make their pink azalea cake or chicken and tomato aspic, here are the recipes that you remember from your childhood. It's sort of Betty Crocker leveraging her past history to appeal to sort of what we'd call retro marketing today. The Betty Crocker Picture Cookbook was only the first of more than 250 Betty Crocker cookbooks that have been sold since the 1950s. And today, Betty Crocker is still dishing out the advice. She has a popular website that's got recipes and advice and gift ideas. She has 5.3 million followers on her Facebook page. You can go to YouTube and watch videos of how to make popular recipes like these lemon thumbprint cookies. That red spoon logo, that logo first appeared in 1954, and it's had just minor modifications over the years. It's the most recognizable symbol of Betty Crocker today. In fact, next time you go to a grocery store, look at the shelves. You'll see that red spoon on not just cake mixes and frosting, but on Bisquick and Hamburger Helper. Today, Betty Crocker is approaching her 100th birthday. If you're looking for help with your burnt cookies or your bread that isn't rising, Betty Crocker might still be your best place to go for advice. You can find her cookbooks in bookstores across the country. You can check out at a grocery store and still find her cookbook pamphlets. First editions of the Picture Cookbook are all over websites like eBay. They can fetch $50 or $75 each. Betty Crocker today is a lot more than just a corporate brand. She's become sort of America's June Cleaver and Dear Abby and Martha Stewart all rolled into one. In 2015, the Daily News of New York estimated that she was one of the 8 most recognized fictional characters in American history, right up there with Barbie and with Santa Claus. And it all started with a puzzle and a bag of flour. If you want to learn more about Betty Crocker, here are a few resources that I recommend. Whatever it is, keep enjoying your history.